Italy lose possession, and it's worth a crack! It's just astonishing! North Macedonia strike it out!
A wise man once said, "Life is a journey of ups and downs," and your reaction to these swift changes in life will dictate if you are able to put the pieces back together and recapture your glory days of the past, or remain in a state of disarray, failing to find the motivation or energy to pursue the goals that were once an obsession. In terms of the beautiful game, when a storied side underestimates the hunger and drive of a smaller one, it often leads to upsets that live forever in the hearts and minds of fans as either a forgettable heartbreak or a memorable triumph. If a catastrophe does occur, it can be a considerably difficult challenge to overcome, as teams are left to theorize about which individual factors contributed to their collective failure. Success in itself is often built through motivation, and in team sports, it usually takes an entire group of players, coaches, and staff to share a common hunger and determination to reach their goals as a group. Everything from injuries to formations and tactical plans play integral parts in a team's overall success, and there is no question that the elites of world football are able to utilize the embarrassment of riches at their disposal to maximize their preparation to in turn avoid a catastrophic result. However, if a squad lacks genuine motivation and or no longer possesses the hunger or mutual desire to be victorious, their downfall will often be both inevitable and tragic, no matter the intricacy of their tactics or individual talent of their personnel. When it comes to Italy and their incredible up and down journey as a national side, their recent failure to qualify for back-to-back World Cups, in contrary to their dominant victory at Euro 2020 in between, has caused many to scratch their heads and wonder what has caused the Italians to go from one extreme to the other. How did a team that exemplified exceptional discipline, togetherness, and determination be crowned champions of perhaps the most competitive continent in world football, only to fail to beat North Macedonia in a must-win game, conceding in the 94th minute, effectively dumping them out of World Cup qualification? Roberto Mancini went from tears of joy hugging his friend Gianluca Vialli after their epic victory over England in 2020 to bitterness and confusion just 256 days later, citing the failure to qualify for Qatar 2022 as the biggest disappointment of his entire career. Many have pointed to an array of divergent factors, from tired legs and the team's lack of goal scorers to a quote classic stubbornness or inconsistency that constantly resurfaces every now and then for Italy, which some have theorized could be the primary reason for their constant waves of success and failure. However, when attempting to identify whether the accusations of inconsistency and a persistent lack of focus against the Azzurri are valid, it's important to take a brief dive into their history as a national side and see whether this theme of incredible dominance being followed up by severe dips in form are prevalent. The intent of this recap is not to simply regurgitate known information about the history of Italy as a national team, but to provide context to the possibility that amongst the tactical and strategic problems that exist today for the Azzurri, a portion of their recent failures can be attributed to a persistent stubbornness, a lack of focus, as well as a general inconsistency that can be identified in multiple eras of their existence. In terms of trophies, the Azzurri are one of the most successful national sides in the history of the game, consistently producing some of the most talented teams led by tactically sound managers who have prioritized winning by instilling a culture built on defensive ruthlessness, strategic cleverness, psychological warfare, and an unbreakable spirit. Italy organized its first official match as a national side in 1910. They would establish themselves as a real force in international football rather quickly, capturing bronze in the 1928 Summer Olympics. They would be invited to take part in the inaugural World Cup in 1930, however, they would decline the invite, opting not to participate in the tournament. Despite their absence, the Azzurri would go on to further cement themselves as a European powerhouse, winning the Central European International Cup on 2 occasions within that period. By the time the 1934 World Cup arrived, Italy decided not only to compete, but to host the competition altogether. They would defeat the likes of Spain, Austria, and the United States in their journey to capturing their first World Cup title in their tournament debut, with many beginning to agree that the Italians had very quickly become the best national team side in the world. They would continue their dominance in the years that would follow, as they would once again medal in the 1936 Olympic Games. However, this time, they would win the entire competition, securing gold and adding another impressive accolade to their history. With the addition of a talented young striker, Silvio Piola, many pundits believed that the Italian squad at the 1938 World Cup was even stronger than the previous one, and they would prove them correct, with the Azzurri defeating Norway, France, Brazil, and Hungary on its way to their second consecutive World Cup title, fully then solidifying themselves as operating on an elevated level from the rest. It's important to note that Italy were at the time under the reign of well-known fascist Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, who was famously rumored for sending a telegram before the 1938 finals that said, "Win or die," although this was never proven. Being led by a fascist dictator, meant that Italy would inevitably be involved in some sensitive political affairs, and by the time World War II rolled around in 1939, Italy would join Germany and Japan as an Axis power. And whilst the Italians had success in the war, their victories were always heavily contested. The country's imperial overstretch ultimately resulted in their defeat, with Mussolini's reign coming to an end when he was arrested after the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. His arrest would cause a civil war in the nation that would end shortly after the former prime minister was assassinated in 1945. Due to the events of the war, the 1938 World Cup turned out to be the last major tournament in 12 years. And when the smoke had finally cleared and FIFA announced that the tournament would evidently resume, teams began their preparation for the 1950 World Cup. Defending champions Italy, however, would find their preparations were permanently damaged when the entire Torino football team lost their lives in the infamous Superga air disaster, just 1 year before their return to the World Cup. This had a severe impact on Italy, as the Torino players were the linchpin of the national team. Aside from the mental and emotional anguish caused by such a tragic disaster, following this accident, the team began traveling by boat, resulting in another complication due to the tragedy. The following period saw the Azzurri struggle to establish even a remnants of their dominance prior to the war. After the defending champions failed to advance from the group stage of the 1950 and 1954 World Cups, they would miss the 1958 edition of the tournament altogether. The Italians very quickly went from being the most dominant force in international football to a team that was struggling to qualify for international tournaments. The 1962 and 1966 World Cup saw Italy return with more talented teams, but they were once again knocked out in the group stage in back-to-back occasions, with many no longer considering the Azzurri as a European elite. To make matters worse, Italy missed out on the first two editions of the European Championships in 1960 and 1964. The Italians were without question very down during this period, and although they were producing talented teams that held world-class names such as Gianni Rivera, Sandro Mazzola, and Giacinto Facchetti, the national team were unable to rescue themselves from their gradual decline, with it seemingly getting worse with each passing year, going from a squad that won back-to-back World Cups in their first two attempts to a team that didn't even qualify and or wasn't able to advance past the group stage of any international tournament for over 16 years. It shows that when analyzing Italy's history, that the Nazionale have had a track record of following up exceptional tournament performances with long stretches of disappointing and in some ways embarrassing results, causing the public and media to have a seesaw perspective on the position of Italy amongst the elites of world football. For the Azzurri, the tide began to turn in their favor just in time for the 1968 Euros. This would be their first time competing in the tournament, and similar to their debut at the World Cup, they would not only host the tournament, but defeat Yugoslavia in the final, claiming their first major trophy in 30 years. The Italians went from ice cold to red hot once again, and they would carry their momentum into the 1970 World Cup. They would hammer through the competition, including an epic clash against West Germany in the semi-final, where they managed to overpower their European rivals in a game known as the Game of the Century, before eventually losing to Brazil in the final, though many believe the Italians were back amongst the best in the world. However, just as Italy were re-establishing themselves as a global powerhouse in the early 70s, they would once again suffer from a sudden severe dip in form that began with the Azzurri failing to qualify for the Euros in 1972, being abruptly knocked out in the group stage of the 74 World Cup and capping it off by once again failing to qualify for the 1976 European Cup. This would be the second time in their history that the Italians would suffer drastic dips in their form, at times so dreadful that it would result in them not being able to qualify for international tournaments on consecutive occasions, with it often coming shortly after eras in which they dominated the competition. In the years that would follow, they would produce teams that hailed all-time great talents such as Paolo Rossi, Roberto Baggio, and Gianluca Vialli, to name a few. The Azzurri would capture their third World Cup title in 1982, despite being plagued by the Totonera match-fixing scandal, which saw numerous players, including Rossi, get suspended from the Italian league. However, Rossi returned to the national team just in time to take part at the World Cup, which proved to be a huge boost to the team's fortunes, as he would go on to win both the Golden Ball and the Golden Boot for his heroic efforts in the tournament. Italy would continue to remain competitive on the international stage, finishing in third at the 1990 World Cup, as well as runners-up at the 1994 World Cup in the US, where Baggio missed a penalty in the final, which essentially handed Brazil the World Cup. However, even through a period of relative success, the Italians' inconsistencies were still evident for all to bear witness to, as they would fail to qualify for both the 1984 and 1992 editions of the European Cup. Ironically, they would make the 88 Euros in between and comfortably make it all the way to the semi-finals before being eliminated, which further cements just how bizarre Italy's international journey has been at times, with performances changing from year to year, causing expectations to also often change, never being able to capture an extended period of time without some sort of unexpected dip in form that often results in a sudden change in morale, a loss of focus, and an inability to qualify for international tournaments. They would remain competitive in their respective campaigns, reaching the quarterfinal at the 1998 World Cup, the finals of Euro 2000, as well as the round of 16 at the 2002 FIFA World Cup, where many believe Italy were unfairly knocked out by host nation South Korea, who were accused of being heavily favored by the Ecuadorian official Byron Moreno, know? Despite another lackluster showing in Euro 2004, which saw them get knocked out in the group stage again, Italy would regain form just in time for the World Cup in 06, fielding one of the greatest squads top to bottom they have ever produced. Winning their 4th FIFA World Cup courtesy of a formidable defense, a tactical discipline, and a moment of madness from the French captain. A team that historically went through astonishing waves of incredible success and embarrassing failure was now 4-time World Cup champions, trailing only the best of the best in Brazil at the top of the history books. And from 2006 onward, it seemed as though Italy have once again fallen into a slump that has caused them to struggle to recapture their winning ways. They would be knocked out in the group stage of the 2010 World Cup, not being able to win a single match in a group that contained the likes of New Zealand, Slovakia, and Paraguay, and leading to the resignation of manager Marcelo Lippi, who was seemingly blamed for the disaster showing by the Italians. Their 2014 World Cup showing wasn't much better, as Italy once again looked poor and failed to get out of the group stage due to their painfully obvious lack of quality and cutting edge. Similar to the end of their 2010 campaign, the manager and his tactical philosophies were blamed, leading to the resignation of Cesare Prandelli. Leading into the qualification period for the 2018 FIFA World Cup, Italy hired journeyman manager Gianpiero Ventura, who hadn't coached a major club prior to taking charge of the Nazionale in 2016, and who very quickly appeared to be very much in over his head. The Azzurri were already in an unfavorable position, coming off back-to-back disappointing World Cup campaigns, with an aging squad seemingly struggling to let go of veteran players who didn't provide much of a difference in their performances. They would also suffer from putting the ball in the back of their net, with the manager electing to bench Insigne, refusing to incorporate him in the system, rendering them unable to score with consistency, which was none more evident when they failed to score in 3 of their last 5 qualifying games, including their must-win games against Sweden. The combination of a clueless new coach, who quite obviously didn't have the pedigree and or coaching acumen to rescue this dying giant from a disaster, mixed with a laundry list of lingering past issues that would make it difficult for any coach in the world to come in and create a plan of action to in turn bring Italy back to winning ways, resulted in a tumultuous environment, one that led to veteran players in the squad such as Chiellini and Barzagli mutinying against the coach and demanding things change. Ventura would deflect blame after the game against Sweden, electing to blame the players' inability to execute, saying after the game, quote, "My record is one of the best of the last 40 years. I lost only 2 games in 2 years." Contrary to the widespread calls for his resignation, Ventura would refuse to step down, resulting in him being sacked 2 days after their epic collapse, with the president of the Italian Football Federation, Carlo Tavecchio, resigning just 5 days later. The man to pick up the broken pieces would be none other than former Man City and Inter Milan manager Roberto Mancini, who would end up being a heaven sent, very quickly integrating his tactics within the squad, electing to play with a more attack-minded approach, one that would restore confidence in the Italian players, with Lazio defender Francesco Azzurri saying that the squad was, quote, "enjoying their football under Mancini." The new manager would not only bring back an enthusiasm amongst the team, but he would also perhaps make his greatest tactical contribution for Italy in the midfield. Mancini's midfield renaissance had taken place around the trio of Jorginho, Marco Verratti, and Nicolo Barella, under the manager's attack-minded 4-3-3 system since he took over the job in 2018. Mancini's men would dominate in qualifiers, winning all 10 games in their group, heading into Euro 2020 as one of the most informed teams in the tournament. Although Italy were not considered amongst the heavy favorites, it certainly didn't come as a shock that they managed to defeat the likes of Belgium, Spain, and England on their way to a second European Cup. However, what did end up coming as a shock was what transpired in the months that would follow their successful triumph at Euro 2020. After looking like quite possibly the best team in the world, one that seemingly had immense discipline, led by a manager who connected with the players and who introduced a style that reinvigorated the squad, Italy would enter World Cup qualifiers where it became evident very quickly that they were not operating at the same level as before. To begin with, quite simply, the players looked exhausted. Much of the squad, especially some of the veterans on the team, were visibly suffering from tired legs. One of the primary components of Italy's tactical resurgence was their ability to press very high up the pitch, with everyone in their team constantly moving to pressure their opponents. However, without the energy to do so, the players struggled to maintain a high press and failing to recover when being broken down. The midfield also slowed down, lacking the creativity and activity that was once the backbone of the success at Euro 2020. With the midfield compromised and the defense struggling due to an aging core, as was a sudden lack of leadership with the departure of Chiellini, the attackers were unable to establish a good rhythm as they were forced to drop deep to often help with defensive duties, evidently leading to the Azzurri morphing back to the same predictable habits they were doing so prior to Mancini's arrival. And without a real goal-scoring number 9 up front, the goals would begin to dry up as Italy would only win 4 out of their 8 World Cup qualifying games, with disappointing draws against teams like Northern Ireland and Bulgaria, resulting in them finishing second in their group to Switzerland, with their spot at the 2022 FIFA World Cup coming down to a playoff tie against North Macedonia, who were ranked 84th in the world at the time. As the story goes, the Italians would neglect everything that made them successful at Euro 2020, electing to resort back to a half-hearted defensive counter-attacking style, choosing to play aging players like Florenzi over Di Lorenzo or Calabria, and the coaching staff stubbornly refusing to take accountability for their tactical misreads. They would lose 1-0 to North Macedonia, resulting in the second straight time the Azzurri would fail to make the World Cup. making it 8 years since the Italians last took part in a World Cup and 16 years since they last competed in a World Cup knockout game. Many have pointed the finger in all different directions, with blame and accountability being passed around like a hot potato between the players, coaches, and the Italian FA. Fans are wondering how much worse it can get after it was announced in August 2023 that Roberto Mancini would be stepping down as the manager of the Nazionale. This would come in the midst of the Azzurri's Euro 2024 qualification campaign, ending a 5-year spell in which the national team experienced continental success but once again missed out on the sport's biggest tournament. Ultimately, Italy have had one of the most unique and unpredictable journeys in the history of the great game. Given their incredibly storied history, one that not only hails 4 World Cups and 2 European Championships, but also a highly regarded legacy amongst all followers of the sport, due to their displays of dominance during several eras, their contributions to the evolution of defensive strategy, and a unique passion and fight that can only be understood and felt by those that share a common enthusiasm for the Azzurri. Upon the sudden departure of Mancini, the Italian Federation appointed former Napoli boss Luciano Spalletti as head coach of the national team, hoping the former Serie A winning manager can somehow recapture the brilliance of this uber-talented Italian side just in time for the start of Euro 2024. And only time will tell whether the Italians will be able to bounce back to winning ways and shock the world with yet another impressive shift in form, or if they will succumb to the contents of their history and spend the next decade or so wondering how to put the pieces back together. However, I would think twice before questioning the possibility of a resurgence amongst the Italians, as they have proved one time or another, when the expectations are low and the opportunity to change the dynamics of their fortune are there to be taken, it is also often when they are at their most dominant.